Hi, Dean Clark.
Hi, Alexis.
It's great to see you again. Just to begin, would you mind introducing yourself briefly?
Of course. So my name is Brietta Clark, and I am a law professor at LMU, Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, California. I have been here over 20 years, focusing on healthcare law, how law shapes healthcare access and quality, and especially how law can either help entrench inequality or help combat it for especially marginalized populations. And what about you, Alexis? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Of course. I'm Alexis Wells-Oghoghomeh. I teach in the Religious Studies department at Stanford. Also affiliated with African American Studies, our new department at the university, as well as the program in Feminist, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. So I'm very, very happy to be here. Most of my research revolves around many of the things we're going to have a conversation about today, although I do so in the era of slavery around thinking about Black women's reproduction, religion, and sexuality. Oh,
And I know our
happy to
work
be here.
intersects a bit there since I do reproductive justice work as well. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
I am as well. Um, so to kick us off, we have this very interesting concept come up in our conversation earlier. Um, Black religious liberty,
Mhm.
which I find to be a really interesting pairing of terms. So if you could talk a little bit from your perspective about what Black religious liberty means to you, especially when we layer in reproduction.
Yeah, yeah. So this may seem a little odd, but I actually think of it as an invitation.
Mm,
I think of it as an invitation to us to consider what religious freedom means through the lived experiences of Black individuals, families, and communities.
mhm,
And I want to be clear too that I don't think that's a monolith, right? So
mhm,
one of the other things that I think of when I think of Black religious liberty is um, kind of digging into all of the rich diversity,
mm.
right, of what that can mean and how it shapes the lives even of a particular racial group, right?
Right.
A particular identity group. Um, I really also see it as an opportunity to reflect on kind of given those lived experiences, how we see faith play out for these groups,
Mhm,
for our communities in the day to day. So, what
mm.
it means at work, at home, at school. And because I do healthcare law, my focus has very much been in the space of when people need help and
Mm.
they have to reach out to healthcare providers to help them kind of throughout their life, but especially around this time of reproduction and birthing.
Right. Right.
What
I
is
really, go ahead.
it?
No, I was going to say, I really like what you said about kind of the lived experience of what does this term religion and Black religious liberty mean? Um, did you have more to add on that?
No, I was just curious about what it means for you.
Yeah, of course. Well, I loved how succinct your answer was because of course mine is not. But I will strive for it because one of the reasons I thought the combination of terms were so interesting is because liberty as a concept has been wielded so loosely, and I think in some ways problematically from a historical perspective for most of our nation's history. So when I think about liberty, I think of it as a concept that in our nation's founding was never intended to be inclusive, which is what's really, really interesting, given how we're using it in the contemporary moment, as if it's this radically inclusive term and it's self-evident. But of
Mhm.
course, we always have to contextualize these terms historically. And when we do so with liberty, I think about, 1775, the American Revolution. I think about the people who were talking about wanting liberty, wanting freedom, they were actually using the language of enslavement to talk about their relationship with the British, even as actual people were enslaved. And it just, that juxtaposition is always really important, I think, when we talk about liberty. But what's really, I think what really challenges that lack of inclusivity is when we put Black in front of it.
Mhm.
I really do think that Black as a concept is radically inclusive. And when I say that, I mean, Black people are not an ethnicity. Black people, Blackness as a historical formation emerges in this moment where there is a need to reduce the multitude into something more singular. Um, and so the ways that Blackness even emerged as taking plurality and making it singular, it always necessarily is messy because it's always holding in tension these many diversities that make up these people who are assigned to this category. And that's always been the case. There's always been linguistic diversity, cultural diversity, ethnic diversity encapsulated in the category. So when I think you talk about Black liberty, and even religion too, religion has never been inclusive as it's defined in this nation. But Blackness is the qualifier, Black is the qualifier, and Black challenges. And just to kind of bring this around, I think about 1777 as the American Revolution is raging. You have Prince Hall and other people and Black people in Massachusetts who challenge the US. They challenge Massachusetts. They challenge these colonial governments using the very language of liberty, using the language about their God-given rights. And they're saying, we have the God-given right to freedom. Slavery is wrong. And so in that moment, I think it's a perfect encapsulation of how Blackness, is always challenging this concept of liberty as it operates here. And reproduction, again, is one of those categories that's always been married to Blackness. Because of how Black people came to typically what became, the lands that became the US. And so in many ways, reproduction has never, and religion and liberty, these are three categories that have never been meant to be inclusive, never been intended to be something that people have full claim to as it's been enacted. But that the ways that Black people and then, Black woman gendered people have pressed and pushed has made it so that our nation's uh, definitions of these concepts has been ever expanding. And it's not just, but I do want to call out the fact that because we are the only group who's ever inhabited this nation for whom reproduction has been so greatly tied to our identities here, and so greatly tied to not just what became the US economy, but the global economy, the Western economy. And so in that way, reproduction, we have a very different relationship as Black people to reproduction, which is why I think we press upon it and challenge it in very radical ways. So I've been intrigued by this concept since we thought about it for all of these historical reasons. But I really, for me, when I thought a lot about it, I said, man, Blackness is what makes what challenges these terms.
Well, and I feel compelled as a law professor, right, to say, I love exactly what you just pointed out, because law plays such a crucial role in defining terms that are contested. What does religious actually mean? What does it mean for religious freedom? What kind of religious practice and concept do we protect? Right.
Right.
So that's one piece, but then also this idea of liberty. It is both aspirational,
Yes.
right? And so it should be constantly challenging us, right? But it is kind of law that is the vehicle through which we are mediating contested visions of liberty and what it means for different groups of people. And so one of the things that makes kind of our kind of focus today on reproduction and the intersection of reproduction and liberty right, through the lens of Black communities, recognizing that even that term may be contested, right, or unclear,
Right. Yeah.
is that, you know, what we've been seeing recently, right, with the rollback of protections around reproductive freedom, right? So the recent Supreme Court case, right, of Dobbs, right? People talk about uh, have been focused on kind of quite a bit, right, for the last
Right.
2 years. The overturning of Roe versus Wade, which was the Supreme Court case, right, where it was first identified that this concept of liberty in the Constitution, right, actually embodies women's ability to make reproductive decisions, right, within a certain point. The rolling back of that is saying, no, we don't actually see that as a protected right, right, under this liberty concept, under the Constitution. And so that's just an example of kind of even what it means, kind of what liberty means in any given context. We are also starting to see, you know, religious liberty getting a bad rap, I'll say, because we see a concept of religious liberty that reflects a very narrow vision of what we think people should be able to do with their bodies and decide. A very particular vision of what it means to protect life, right? And when a pregnant woman or another pregnant person should have the ability to decide for themselves kind of whether or not to continue with a pregnancy and how to continue with that pregnancy. And so, you know, this is something where there's been a very narrow vision of religion that has been seen as antithetical to and an impediment to that freedom.
Right.
But one of the things that I so appreciated about your work when I was reading your book was just how important our conceptions of religion and faith are to those of us, right, who think about what we should do for our bodies, what responsibility we owe to our communities, our families, potential life, right? That shapes us. And that's myriad, it's varied, right? There are people that have different conceptions of what their faith requires them to do or allows them to do, right? When it comes to making those kinds of reproductive decisions. There's just not one view of that. And yet out in the world, there's a narrative that somehow kind of, if you're religious, there's a particular way to think about this. So I think that's another thing that, again, interrogating the meaning of religious liberty through Black experience is one of the things that I think helps to nuance our understanding of not only the kind of contested nature of liberty and religion, but how those two things work together when we have to mediate conflicts in our society around the limits that government should be allowed to place on our decision making when it comes to reproduction.
I mean, I love what you said here. Law is the vehicle, you know, that mediates, you know, our contested concepts of liberty. I mean, that is a beautiful articulation of the role it plays, because I think there's so, just thinking about, you know, where I sit as a historian, I think we can wax really eloquently about historically how things have functioned. Or, you know, when we do the histories of lived religion, the histories of lived practice, we can talk about what's happening on the ground, but we always have to hold in our minds what's happening on these meta levels. As much as whether or not people agree with the laws, they are governing how they are able to behave and how they're able to make decisions. So absolutely, I think that was a wonderful way to underscore how important it is for us to always be mindful and kind of reading these lived experiences and these conceptual definitions alongside what's happening in the legal sphere. Yeah.
Well, Alexis, maybe we can talk a little bit more about exactly how government has interfered with reproduction, and even religiously motivated reproductive decisions by Black people, Black faith communities. I know your work focuses on kind of historical traditions. I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah.
And then maybe I could talk about, kind of what I see continuing today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Um, you know, when we talk about the government, it's so interesting. I think we still do this thing. We talk about it in very abstract ways, as if it's not elected officials that we put in place to make these decisions for us. But looking backwards, one of the things I always say, particularly when I'm teaching, because I think people tend, at least my students, and I mean, I know I don't know if this is the same in law classes, but they think about the government in these very abstract, kind of philosophical ways.
Mhm.
Um, and I always underscore that in the antebellum period, in the colonial period, the government were usually the same people who were making most decisions. And so, thinking about this whole question of reproduction, we can't think about reproduction in this nation, reproductive controls, without thinking about slavery, and that's my wheelhouse. So I can talk about it all day. um, but really, slavery is bound up in questions of reproduction because um, when we think about how late, so the colonies that became the US, the British North American colonies, French, Spanish colonies that eventually became the US, were very, very late to make what became our nation into kind of a slaveocracy. Late by comparison to the Caribbean, late by comparison to South America. And so by the time we get to this point, you have a lot of people who've already been imported into the Caribbean and into South America. And the system was established. When people died, because these were incredibly brutal systems, you just imported more people. Well, of course, 1808, the British decide that, they shut down the slave trade. And so people have to think about other ways for getting the labor that they need to power the economy. And so this is when natural increase becomes really, really important in what will become, or what was already at that time, the United States, because there is no other way to make the economy grow at the rate it grew. I mean, if we're thinking about the American Revolution ending in 1783, and we're thinking about the US being a new nation, how do we become a powerhouse in a very short order? It doesn't happen without the economic power provided by enslaved people, the skill, the intelligence, the just all of the things that are being imported in with these people who are not just coming from Western Africa, they're also coming from the Caribbean. And so thinking about this question of how the government has control, they had to control. This had to be primary, not only because we had to make sure we had our labor source, a steady supply of labor, but we also had to make sure that we had the social controls that allowed the perpetuation of slavery. We had to delineate, enslaved people by land and sea. Those, who came by sea, AKA Africans and their descendants, were enslaved for perpetuity. Those who came by land, which were mostly indigenous people and the Americans, usually had some sort of period at which their servitude would end. We also had to create anti-miscegenation laws, because what happens when we are reproducing? When the human encounter happens, there is no, we can't easily keep these lines. So of course, slavery had to follow the condition of the mother, because sexual abuse was so rampant during the era of enslavement that the so-called government had to create these controls. And so oftentimes when I think about the role the government has played, especially in controlling Black reproduction, I think about the necessity of Black reproduction for the health and success of the government. And they relied upon my foremothers' bodies to make this nation into what it was. They relied upon their capacity to tell their children, teach their children how to do the things they needed to do in order to continue to power the economy. And not just mothers, fathers, sisters, uncles, grandparents. These are the people whose labor, and again, I always want to put in sexual labor, reproductive labor, intellectual labor, skilled labor, agricultural labor. These are the people who allowed the US to emerge onto the scene, especially in the 20th century, as an absolute powerhouse, which if you look at the long span of history of nations, is absolutely remarkable. And so for me, oftentimes when I think about the government, I think about slaveholders. I think about the people who were involved in the day-to-day of violence and violation of enslaved people, who also put laws in place, went into Congress, ran for president, won the presidency, and made sure that their ways of life were maintained over and over again, of course, until we get to 1861 and the Civil War.
Wow, thanks, Alexis, for kind of giving us that historical context, which unfortunately, we see remnants of continuing today in kind of obviously less explicit or kind of officially legal ways, but there is still a great deal of regulation, control, surveillance of the reproduction of Black communities. And so I'll talk a little bit about, first though, the fact that this hasn't gotten a lot of attention. That in fact, when we talk about reproduction, and again, especially the kind of dominant narrative of religious liberty, right, as a type of right that is kind of used to try to deny other people's ability with respect to reproduction, the focus has been on the ability to terminate a pregnancy, right? Prevent a pregnancy. And the idea of kind of religion and religious liberty is allowing people to, for example, refuse to provide information to a pregnant patient about perhaps the need for an abortion or termination because their pregnancy is high risk. And I want to be clear that has very serious consequences for Black women, Black communities, because they have some of the highest health risk around pregnancy. The morbidity outcomes, mortality outcomes, so right, severe health harms, or even kind of threat to life, right? The rates of that are so much higher for Black women than other groups of women, even after factoring in things like income level or insurance status. So I want to be clear that that is an important focus that people have right now that impacts, Black women's health and ability to make decisions. But what Alexis talked about is another part of this. It's another side of this that we often don't hear about. And that's the fact that for many communities, many Black women today and Black communities, they are running into impediments to be able to give birth, to be able to parent with dignity. And for these communities, this is very much linked, oftentimes, of course, not always, but oftentimes to their faith, to what it means for them, right? For their religious liberty, right? To be able to procreate, to be able to expand their family, right? And they're running into barriers. They run into a few different kinds of barriers. We've seen historically in our nation that there have been forced sterilization. Things have continued in less overt ways. And so, for example, it is pretty recent that California prisons have come under scrutiny for coerced sterilization, lack of informed consent for sterilization of women who are in prison. They've had to kind of make really important reforms. But that went on for many decades until very recently. So one of the things that we see in healthcare is how hospitals have become a site of surveillance and policing of certain women's reproduction. And of course, these populations tend to be low income, women of color, and in many cases, women who already have some other really serious health challenge or illness that makes them actually really dependent on the healthcare system for help through pregnancy. And so what we're seeing is that healthcare providers, physicians, nurses, in some cases, are working with police to identify certain kind of women who are pregnant and come into the hospital for assistance as risky, as threats to their children, right, their potential children, and flagging them for greater surveillance and control. And this has resulted in things, for example, like them being reported to child welfare services and now being kind of put under further scrutiny where all of their decision making, including future decisions about reproduction, are being surveilled by the state in ways that, you know, kind of they fear can result in the state doing something that interferes with their family, even potentially takes their children away. So it's putting them under much greater scrutiny. And for reasons of poverty in many cases. So concerns of, you know, kind of whether this person has enough resources to care for a child, which should trigger supports, greater resources, right, by the state, if anything. But unfortunately, instead, often trigger surveillance, attempts to control decision-making, and a fear that a person's exercise of autonomy that's different from what the state thinks the person should be doing will be punished, right, by ripping the family apart. And so one of the things I will just tell you we see is kind of a movement called reproductive justice, right, that has really been centered through the lens of Black communities and Black women that say, you know, recognize that what real reproductive health requires is real reproductive freedom and the ability to help determine, right, whether it's about kind of continuing with a pregnancy, not getting pregnant, or being able to be pregnant and determine the type of birth and be able to parent with dignity and without interference and control and surveillance and under fear. And so this it's broader conception of religious justice. Again, for many women, religion and faith can play a role throughout, right, with the range of types of choices, because it's really how they experience and understand the choices that they want to make and feel they need to make, oftentimes not only for themselves, but thinking about their families, right, and their communities and what they need to be there for them.
I absolutely love the fact that you are laying out for everyone right now, kind of these things are happening right now in real time. But of course, it's absolutely heartbreaking because these things are happening right now in real time. And these are people, families, parents, children who are having to experience this surveillance, this policing, this violence as a matter of the state. And the states oftentimes, you know, what's the word? Because the word that's coming to mind is spotty, but I know that's not a very sophisticated word, but this kind of spotty manifestation of care, protection, which is actually, I think, a residue of the paternalism or maternalism, but paternalism is the word we use, but the paternalistic ideas that were that gave birth to the state You know, these are actual patriarchs, actual people who think they know better, people who think, who, as a matter of course, think that I should have the right to control other people who do not own land, who are not white, who are not male. And I should have the right to intrude upon these intimate spaces in your life. Um, so, I mean, in many ways, what you're talking about, again, the past is always with us, because I wonder sometimes if the reasons why some people are so comfortable with this, why reproductive justice, as you've articulated it, is not a part of the national conversation. Abortion is the national conversation. It's not about what happens to children in the foster care system. It's not about what happens to families when kids have been taken out of the home and not put back. What happens to parents? What happens to grandparents? It's about this one thing you talked about, the termination of pregnancy. Um, the question for me is like, I mean, the question that your comments raise for me is like, who has the right to life? And what does life mean? And that is a religiously inflected question. Um, One of the many things that I think we have discussed kind of in the iterations of this is just kind of how subjective this category of religion is, how personal these conversations we're having are. When we talk about right to life, we are talking about a particular moment, um, a moment that has been isolated by certain religious voices as a moment that is critical to our society's moral future. But when you step back, and of course, I always step back and think about enslaved women, and I think about the ways that their understandings of what we now call religion are so different, how it challenges this idea of this moment. And what does it mean to have, what does right to life even mean to people who are coming from a radically different, I don't even use the word religion. I use cosmology, because when we talk about people who are not a part of the Abrahamic traditions, unless you're talking about Islam, but many people, that the only, if even if they've had exposure, they are still coming, the basis, they are still exposed foundationally to these religious traditions that are non-Abrahamic. They are coming from different ways of understanding humans' relationship to the spirit world or to the disembodied world, humans' relationships and responsibilities to one another, and humans' stages of existence. And so thinking about enslaved women, Sasha Turner talks about that 9-day rule in her book, and I picked it up in my book. Her book is on enslaved women in the British Caribbean. But I mean, that's one of those instances where, there is a time, a period before which a child that has been a human that has been born becomes an actual full person. And in that window, things happen. And you are not a person until you are acknowledged by the community into which you were born, or you are acknowledged by the person or people to whom you were born. There are different ways to understand what life is, what life means, what it means. One of the interesting things about enslaved women that I found in my research, and when you talk about, you know, who has right to life and what does this mean and why are we so hyper focused on this, is how um, their cosmological understandings allowed them to both value and cherish children, but also terminate pregnancies. It was not mutually exclusive. It's not a zero-sum game for them. You can both value children and understand that there are circumstances in which it is not, your child may not be, they may not thrive. You may not thrive. And so this is one of those instances where I think that when we talk about how we are defining, right to life, when we think about um, the policing, the surveillance you talked about, and the ways that that is signaling who has the right to parent, who has the right to bring children into this world, who has the right to live unhindered, unharassed as a parent in this world. or as a person giving birth, because that, that hospital piece that you talked about resonates particularly on a very personal level with me. Just the level of surveillance that comes with being in these institutional spaces that were born of these moments when they were trying to control, exert greater control, medicalize and exert greater control over aspects of reproductive life that historically were not within the realm of the institution or the state, in terms of on the private level, on the interpersonal level. So when I think about this, and the policing, the surveillance, and all the things that this signals, I think about the ways that, historically enslaved women push back. One of the things that makes religion, as we use it, so interesting is that it is so private. We make it very public, but it is really, really private. It's really intimate in how it exists on a day-to-day basis. It's very mundane. It's about, the food you feed your families or that you eat yourself. It's about the rituals that you perform day in and day out, whether it be, waking up and saying a prayer or lighting a candle on a shrine or, prostrating, whatever it is you do throughout your day, or even something as simple as, do no harm. I will walk into the world and not attempt not to harm someone today. These are all a part of our ritual repertoires. These are all a part of religious repertoires. And I think one of the greatest tragedies that I talk about as a religious historian, like putting on my hat just as a religious historian, is the ways that we have pinned religion down as a tool of control. It's always about power, but power is not always about control, and so religion inherently, for me as I teach it, is always about power. Whether you're talking about accessing power in a different realm or trying to connect to power elsewhere, or you're talking about power in like the papacy. You're talking about institutional power. You're talking about the power to make laws according to what you believe should happen. It's always about power. And because it's about power, it can be used, it can be weaponized, or it can be a source of strength and comfort in that very mundane way. And so as we think about, like, as I think about the ways enslaved women push back, and I would imagine, the ways that women continue to push back now, I really do think less about the institutional iterations of religion. I think about the mundane. I think about the ethical decision-making. I think about the intimate decision-making they made, no matter how their slaveholder mandated whether or not they could go see their partner or with whom they should be in relationship with, the ways that they chose to reserve certain aspects of their being for the people they chose. Something as simple as choice can be a religious decision, can be a very intimate, sacred decision. I choose this partner. I choose to procreate with this partner. I choose not to procreate with this partner, whether or not we had sexual relationship. These are very intimate but sacred things. And for enslaved women, because sexual assault was routine, that was a part of the mundane. That was not episodic. It was something that happened to most women, I would argue. It's hard for us to track this as historians, but there's just so much evidence that this is just a part of it. This is a part of the psychological violence of enslavement. One of the things they did was hold themselves apart. They held these intimate parts of themselves for themselves as a way to push back against these intrusions. And when I talk about intrusions, I'm talking about the actual physical intrusion of sexual assault. But that physical intrusion was a part of the apparatus of the state, which is why children follow the condition of the mother. I could rape you, and then you will bear my children and make me richer. So these intrusions are not just, they're not just literal, they're not just figurative, they are a part of the way the state operated, the way power operated in this nation. And so they did these very, very delicate and intimate maneuvers to hold pieces of themselves back. And for me, at least, whether or not it was connected to faith, as we say it, because faith is a very Abrahamic concept. And most enslaved people were not a part of an Abrahamic faith. They did not really convert. Those who were Muslim. So they would talk differently about faith than Christians. Or faith, not at all. Faith was not something they would talk about normally. And then the rest of them understood Christianity as a tool of the state. So they were very, very resistant to it. But when we talk about the sacred, we talk about the intimacy of self-care, the sanctity of self-care, the sanctity of survival. Okay, because surviving was a sacred act, I would argue, for them. The great Dolores Williams, the Sisters of the Wilderness, a theologian, coined this concept of survival and quality of life, which is just a brilliant way to talk about the ethical rubrics that most enslaved women, and I would argue not just enslaved Black women, because even if you weren't enslaved, your children were subjected to apprenticeships. You were policed and surveilled, and you did not live a free life. So when we talk about, the quality of life and survival, I think this is the way we get to ethics, ethical rubrics, religious ways of thinking without going through faith. Faith, it can be a part of it. Christianity and Islam and Judaism can be a part of it, but this is a part of the worldview. This is a part of the world sense, as Onslaught would say, just the way people sensed and inhabited the world, given that they were coming from West and West Central Africa, where these things they were a part of how people understood, how they move through space and time. We have responsibilities and commitments, not just to the born, but to the unborn. The unborn can exist without being born, and them not being born is not some sort of grand moral crime. Sometimes that is the way materiality has chosen to manifest, and that's it. And so I think there's a much more pragmatic way. When we talk, you talked about reproductive justice and the ways that, because so many of the things that you're talking about are targeted at low income and Black, Indigenous, Black and Indigenous women. And of course, Indigenous women and Native American women have a horrendous history around reproductive crimes. But when you talk about that, I think about the ways that Black women have already, especially when we talk about before we get to the era where we could participate in the legal system or in the social system, the ways we can do now, how they have a history of holding themselves, redefining the term religion, or even not even working with it, really just eschewing it and operating according to rubrics that have been passed down to them for a very, very long time, that I think in many ways remain unarticulated in these communities. Ways, I called it common sense, because, I hate to say this, but like if you are, born of a family where you had some, Black female elder figure around, what common sense is. Like, even though they say common sense is not, act like you have some sense has been a term that has been used over and over again. And I find it really interesting because, not because it's referencing something in particular. I mean, I think it is, but not because of that, because it's also a point of reference for a sensibility that people can have that is not articulated, it's not written down, it's not something that we can pinpoint very easily, but it exists. And that is where I think the power of Black women's reproductive religiosity lies, in things that have again, that ways they cherish life, the ways they choose to have children, even when they don't have the means in the bank, and the ways they have said, I cannot do this, and they've been supported. There are different ways it gets articulated, but I think that over and over again, for me, I think about the ways religion itself as a term is limiting because it doesn't, unless we open it up beyond the institutional manifestations that are so often pointed to define it, it can't capture what I've seen Black women doing in the colonial and antebellum era with their reproductive lives. And I'm curious, I mean, what do you see? Like, because again, I sit and live my life in the pre-20th century era. I love it. And I always say I'm allergic to the 20th and 21st centuries. I live here, but I do not want to think about it. But I'm curious, I mean, for you, as you're thinking about and all these forms of surveillance and policing and the kind of turn to reproductive justice, what does that look like for Black women, or the women who are fighting for it in particular?
So thank you so much for that, Alexis. And you just hit on something that I think is exactly what I was hoping this conversation about Black religious liberty would help us all do. So
Mm,
you just even redefining how we should think about what religion looks like, what spirituality looks like, how it's practiced. And you use the concept of sacred in terms of pushing back against kind of the experiences, the control, the harms that Black women have experienced, right, in our system. And so I have to tell you, one of the things I got excited and I was like, wait, let me find this. Because one example of Black women taking control back of their reproductive choice and health is through a study, and it is called the Sacred Birth Study.
mm,
Right? So this isn't even officially couched as a religious thing at all, right? And yet, and I want to kind of really highlight this. Sacred is a term that stands for safety,
mm,
autonomy, communication, racism, empathy, and dignity. So this is a study that was designed to come up with, so to develop and then validate a quality improvement tool. So a way to measure effectively the experience of Black women using anti-race and equity-based lens. And I want to make sure I get this right. This specifically was developed, and it says exclusively for, by, and with Black mothers and birthing people. So this is not just even a top-down kind of theoretical kind of tool for really helping us spotlight, understand, expose, but create kind of a concrete way of transforming the experience of Black women. This
mm.
is by and for Black women,
Yeah.
who, again, I want to emphasize are their, kind of mothers, right? So again, this is within the space of wanting to, as part of kind of our definition of what it means to live fully, what it means to be well, what it means to have a meaningful, flourishing life, to be able to give birth and parent with that dignity, right? And so this is just one example of, the question or this kind of notion of kind of how are we pushing back, right, against encroachment on both religious liberty, reproduction, and this is a very subtle way, right? This sacred birth study of trying to take control of, educate, and transform these experiences that we have. And it shouldn't be surprising that the people championing this study and driving it forward were influenced by the reproductive justice movement, right? And
Mm,
so you ended talking about the reproductive justice movement. And once again, I would say that that may not be an explicitly kind of religious liberty movement in the way we are used to kind of seeing the organizations that kind of claim the mantle of religious liberty, right, out in the world, and who have largely defined it in many ways through, for example, litigation or policy, right? But it is absolutely this notion of kind of all of the things that go into why dignity is important, why autonomy is important, why liberty is important, because it is kind of the set of beliefs, ideology, kind of principles, right? And the different ways that we understand these things and believe they should guide us through our lives, right? Our conscience, what we feel we are compelled to do. And so I would say, kind of those are two examples, right? Even though they may not be obvious. And it's not surprising to me that these are the ways in which we are seeing the reclaiming of spiritual freedom, if you will, and control occurring. And it goes back to one other thing you said that is exactly right, Alexis, which is we've largely treated religious rights as this kind of private thing. Historically, we've done that with reproduction too, actually. And so what's interesting is the other thing that we do in our country in terms of law when we conceive of a right is our country has conceived of rights largely in negative terms. So you have the right against somebody interfering with doing X, Y, and Z. You have the right to be free from, right, being kind of imprisoned unless, right, there is due process and all of these other things, right? They're largely negative rights. In our country, we don't conceive as rights. Our Constitution, for the most part, does not define rights in positive terms that would create an affirmative duty by government to ensure we have the resources to be able to actualize the right, right? So, and so in the case of reproduction, for example, why has the narrative largely been about the ability to terminate? Well, because part of the focus has been the government's actions to try to deny that. Right? So it's defined in terms of what you can't deny me, right? What you can't interfere with. People have not successfully said, but this notion of a right of reproductive right choice, for example, was the term used for many years under Roe versus Wade. That means you actually have to help give me resources to be able to carry out my choice, right? Whether it's a termination or what actually the reproductive justice movement has really tried to focus on is, kind of the right and resources to support birthing and pregnancy, right? For those who really ground arguments about life and wanting to encourage birth in religious liberty, that has not translated into making sure we are providing resources for people to feel they have families who are supported, right? And that they will then have the resources to be able to give birth safely, right? And so this is one of the challenges, right? This is one of the things that operates to limit, at least from a legal perspective, that operates to even limit our conversation. What we decide is even a practical conversation to have about how we try to claim the ability to exercise religious freedom and what that looks like, including what that would look like in the context of reproductive decision-making. I will tell you that, in the midst of kind of the legal kind of battles around abortion, we have seen that there are some people who have tried within litigation to assert religious liberty as a basis for kind of combating laws that would restrict access to abortion. And making more explicit and formal the kind of connection that you already identified, Alexis, which is, right, kind of the way our faith informs our calculations and understanding of what it means to really support life and embrace it kind of in the very real circumstances where a pregnancy and birth could actually undermine and threaten health and life, right? But again, that hasn't worked so well in the law. It's very hard in many cases. It seems to be able to kind of use certain rights effectively to try to make sure people can continue to have access to the things that they need, apart from government kind of coming after them directly, right? To deny them directly. Government has been able to do a lot to say, you have the right to go do X, Y, and Z, but that's your individual private right for you to try to find the resources to do that. That doesn't mean we have the obligation to help you do that. So, these are some of the challenges, I think, with pushback within the law, and why that isn't as successful. And we don't hear religious liberty used that way successfully. But I want to say this again. People do have this conception of religious liberty that's different than a dominant conception that we keep hearing.
Right.
And so, again, it's important to understand that may not make its way into the law in the way that would kind of create the kind of power in terms of what you can do with it. You referenced the power, right, of law and how that's used, right? The power of religion and how that's used. But kind of coming back to this notion of, so why are we talking about Black religious liberty? Because it's important to understand that dominant narrative is not the only story.
Yes.
Right? That is not reflecting everybody's experiences and story and belief, and relationship with faith, what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, why Black religious liberty? I think you summed it up. I mean, bringing us full circle. You just did it beautifully. Like, this is why we are talking about it, because it does index a kind of a point of departure, something that's different from the mainstream. What does that look like? It looks like reproductive. It looks like sacred birth. It looks like something different, especially when its starting point, or one of its primary points of conversation, is the reproductive sphere, and what kinds of powers, or what kind of control women, gendered people, birthing people should be able to exercise over their reproductive lives. It creates a different, Black religious liberty does something when we put those two in conversation. So I absolutely agree. And you talked about negative rights, the ways that, I never thought about that. Obviously, I was someone who declined my law school scholarship and went to divinity school. So never sat in a law class. But that's right. I never really thought about that. Like, what you don't do, what you have the right for someone else not to do. And so just kind of ending on a hopeful note.
Yes.
What is your thought or hope for the future, when we think about Black religious liberty and reproductive justice?
My hope is that the notion of religious liberty becomes more capacious, more diverse, is viewed as a space for different experiences to help fill out meaning, and for people to be in conversation, and then to ask, so what does this mean for how we should order our lives and our relationships, right? Having that richness inform our discussions, around law and policy, right? When it comes to shaping, gosh, our access to, an ability to make decisions about the things that are absolutely most fundamental to not only our physical health, but our well-being and our role as community members who can thrive, and move us forward in positive ways.
That's beautiful. Yeah, the capaciousness is something I really resonate with because, the running joke among religious studies scholars is you never tell anybody what you do on an airplane. And we don't, most of us don't, because there is something very limiting about how most people understand what it means to study religion. We don't go to Buddhism, we don't go to humanism, we don't go to the diversity. We go to the homogeneity of what is known, what is popular, what is much more kind of present in the public eye. So I think I resonate with that hope of kind of more capacious understandings of religious liberty. And I would add to that understanding religion without the binaries. I think there's something very binary about how our society has come to understand how religion as a category is embodied, how it's lived, how it's expressed, how it's defined. It's heaven and hell. It's, either you believe in God or you don't. It's God. It's and there's something very limiting again, about this binary way we tend to think in this world about many things. That binary structure of thought that has been bequeathed to us through the cosmological structures of Abrahamic traditions, mostly because that's what's dominated the United States, has translated how we think about sexuality, how we think about reproduction, how we think about gender. It's race, like it's all there. So, I think I agree because we have to change the cosmological structure of how we define existence. I think we really have to think more capaciously, think about plurality and diversity as the norm. And I think within that, my final hope would be that Black woman gendered people's bodies are normalized, because I do think there are a lot of ways where we are still anomalous, we are still on display, we are still spectacles. Whether we're in the birthing room or we're, wherever we are, there is an absence of boundaries, a commodification of, I think about the concept of dismemberment that I discussed in my book. And that is the way many modern, and thinking about modernity as the start of the 16th century, nations have learned to relate to Black woman gendered people as people that they can take apart, that they can commodify, our wombs, our hair, our lips, whatever. And then that becomes a real problem when we are actual whole human beings standing in front of a healthcare provider needing care. It's hard to disentangle that. So I think I would add, in agreement with you, more capacious understandings of religious liberty, and then also the normalization of the bodies, the sexuality, the dreams, the hopes, the materiality of Black woman gendered people.
Beautiful.
All right. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alexis. This means quite a bit to me. So I appreciate I don't get to chat with folks from divinity school often, right?
Yeah.
So to be able to reach across and hear your insight, it's helping me think in new ways about something that I care deeply about and have been working on for a long time. So I'm grateful to you. Thank you.
Yes, of course.